When my husband laughed and called my company an expensive hobby in front of 20 of his employees, he had no idea that a year later he would be signing documents that made me his new owner. The night it happened was a Christmas party. Jason's company rented out a restaurant on the top floor of a hotel in Dallas, the kind of place with a view of the city lights and servers who refill your glass before it's half empty. I wore a black dress I had bought for a client dinner the week before. I remember that detail because I remember thinking, standing in front of the mirror before we left, that I looked like someone who ran a real company. Which I did. I just hadn't yet figured out how to make Jason see that. We arrived together. He took my coat at the door. He was in a good mood that night, the kind of expansive, generous mood that came over him at his own events, when he was the host and the room organized itself around him. He introduced me to people the way you introduce a pleasant but not particularly interesting piece of furniture. This is Claire, my wife. She does some design work. Each time, he'd move on before whoever it was had a chance to ask a follow-up question. I had been running my company for 6 years at that point. 12 full-time employees. A roster of clients that included 2 publicly traded firms. We had just finished our best revenue quarter to date. None of that was visible to anyone in that room, because Jason had a way of preemptively defining what I was before I could define myself. One of his senior managers, a man named David, stopped us near the bar around 9. He had the kind of face that stays earnest regardless of the situation, wide eyes, always leaning slightly forward, genuinely curious. He shook my hand with both of his and asked, "So, what does your company do exactly?" I opened my mouth. Jason got there first. "She makes beautiful presentations and logos. You know, creative stuff." He smiled when he said it. Not a mean smile. That was the hardest part. He was never cruel on purpose. He was careless. He said it the way you'd describe a neighbor's garden project. Harmless. Even a little fond. A few people around us laughed politely. The way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke. I smiled. I said, "Yes, something like that." Then I excused myself and walked to the bathroom. Not because I needed to. Because I needed 3 minutes where nobody could see my face. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, something I'd started doing in my 20s when I needed to reset fast. I looked at myself in the mirror and said out loud, quietly, "You have a meeting in Phoenix next Tuesday with a client worth more than his car." Then I dried my hands and went back out. That was the first time I remember doing the math. The math of what my company actually was versus what Jason described it as. The numbers didn't add up the way he told them. They never had. I had just kept choosing not to say so. So I kept track. The next one was his parents' barbecue in April. His father, Robert, was the kind of man who asked direct questions and expected direct answers. He grilled burgers in the backyard and wore an apron that said "World's Okayest Chef," which his youngest grandchild had given him, and which he wore with total sincerity. I liked Robert. He listened to you with his whole body, turning slightly toward you, not scanning the room for someone more interesting. He asked about my business while Jason was getting drinks from the cooler by the fence. When Jason came back and caught the question still hanging in the air, he set down the bottles and said, "Let's not call it a business yet. It's more of a hobby right now." Robert looked at him, then at me, then back at him. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds too long. The kind of silence that has a shape. I said, "We've had a strong quarter, actually." Then I asked Robert about his tomatoes. He talked about tomatoes for 15 minutes. The soil pH, the watering schedule, the particular variety he'd chosen. I listened to every word. Not because I was hiding. Because I genuinely wanted to hear about the tomatoes. Later, in the car, Jason said, "I didn't mean anything by it." I said, "I know." He turned up the radio. I watched the highway lines disappear under the car and thought about the invoice I had sent out that morning from Robert's kitchen while the coffee was brewing. $87,000. Due in 30 days. For a rebranding project a healthcare group had chosen us for over 3 other agencies. Not because we were cheaper. Because our work was better. Jason did not know any of this. He had not asked. But the one I still think about, the one that took something I hadn't yet found a word for, was the event in Austin. A charity business dinner in late spring. black tie, round tables with white linens. I was talking to Hannah, who ran a consulting firm I had been wanting to connect with for months. We had finally gotten into a real conversation, the kind where both people are leaning in slightly and the noise of the room falls back. She had asked about our growth strategy. I told her. And then I told her about the contract we'd just signed with a logistics company. $300,000. The biggest single contract my company had landed to that point. Her eyes went wide. She said, "Claire, that's incredible." And then Jason's voice came from 2 feet away, louder than it needed to be. "Can you imagine?" he said. "She still thinks her little agency is a real company." He was saying it to the man next to him, but he said it with the volume of someone who wanted to be heard. Hannah stopped moving. The smile on her face went still. The glass was halfway to her mouth and stayed there suspended. She did not know where to look. I did not look at Jason. I said to Hannah, "I'd love to get coffee sometime. I'll follow up on Monday." She said, "Yes, absolutely," her voice a little too careful. I excused myself and walked through the ballroom, through the lobby, out through a side door into the parking lot. The air outside was warm and smelled like exhaust and jasmine from some hedge along the building's edge. I stood between 2 parked cars and breathed. When I looked at my phone to go back in, 4 minutes and 12 seconds had passed. Jason had a glass award on his desk at home. A heavy piece of glass about 30 centimeters tall, engraved with Founder of the Year, 2017. He'd won it from a regional business association. He showed it to everyone who came over. During conversations about business, his hand would drift toward it and settle on it the way you'd rest your hand on a railing. Once, I watched him hold it for 11 minutes while explaining to our neighbor how he had disrupted regional logistics technology. I timed it. The neighbor nodded at appropriate intervals. I refilled the wine glasses. I never said a word about the award. I just noticed it. Every single time. The morning I found out the truth about Jason's company, I wasn't looking for anything. It was a Tuesday in September. I was working from the kitchen table. Jason had been working from home more often lately. I had noticed, but not asked why. He got a call sometime around 11 and walked into the other room. He left his laptop open on the kitchen island. I was not going to look at it. Then a notification appeared. An email from Greg Foster, his CFO. The subject line was in capital letters, "Urgent, cash flow forecast." The attachment had opened automatically. A spreadsheet. I walked over and stood in front of the laptop and read what was on the screen. The company had lost its largest client 8 weeks earlier. There was a bank payment due in 6 weeks that the current funds column did not suggest meeting comfortably. The operating reserves had been declining for 8 months in a row. I could see it in the left columns, each month a little lower than the last. And at the bottom, a single cell highlighted in yellow. Available operating cash, $41,772. Jason had around 50 employees. 2 office locations. Ongoing vendor contracts. For a company of that size, $41,000 was not a cushion. It was a window. And the window was closing. I walked back to my side of the table. I sat down. I opened the document I had been working on before and kept working. His coffee was still on the counter, completely cold by the time he came back 20 minutes later. He drank it anyway, standing at the counter, looking at his phone. He glanced at the laptop. He did not seem to notice anything had changed about the screen. He did not know I had seen. I did not say a word. 2 weeks later, he had friends over for dinner. The conversation turned to business, as it always did in that house. Someone asked Jason how things were going. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Strong. Really strong." Then he said, "Claire's been running around with her agency friends again." He looked at me and smiled. "Still playing the startup game, aren't you?" There was laughter. The comfortable laughter of people who don't know they're missing information. I said, something like that, and reached for my wine glass. 3 weeks after that, at an industry event I attended alone, I ran into a colleague of Jason's named Peter. He was a friendly, slightly nervous man who talked too fast when he was uncomfortable. He asked how Jason was doing. I said he seemed busy. Peter said, "Yeah, I heard they had a rough few months. Lost the Hartwell account." The Hartwell account. The client I had seen listed on the spreadsheet as the largest one lost. I said, "These things happen," and moved on to talk to someone else. That night Jason came home late. He said the drive had been bad. He said he was tired. He sat at the kitchen island, and I poured him a glass of water, and he said, "You know what the problem with this industry is? People don't appreciate what you've built until it's gone." He was talking about himself. He didn't know it. I said, "That's probably true." He said, "Your little agency is lucky it's small. Less exposure." I said, "Probably." He went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour and worked. What I did in those months, beginning that September week and continuing through October and November, was nothing that would have looked unusual to anyone watching from the outside. I still went to the events. I still smiled at the right moments. I still sat next to Jason at dinners. Outwardly, I was exactly the same person I had always been. What changed was the velocity of the work I was doing privately. The investor conversations I had been having for months moved into a different register. Less exploratory. More operational. Ethan Price was central to all of it. I had met Ethan 18 months earlier through a mutual contact. He wore the same dark jacket to every meeting and kept a small black notebook that he dated at the top of a blank page before each conversation started. When someone in an early meeting started talking about brand sentiment and market narrative without citing anything real, Ethan said, without looking up, "Show me the report. The rest is decoration." He said it quietly. Nobody argued. He never interrupted me. He waited until I was completely finished, then asked one precise question. Every single time. At some point I realized it wasn't a technique, it was just how he listened. In October I flew to New York and signed the investment agreement. For signatures across 3 documents. When I put down the pen, Ethan looked at me across the table and said, "Now we build." That was everything he said. I flew back to Dallas that evening. Jason picked me up from the airport. He asked how the trip went. I said it was good. He turned on a podcast and drove home. In late October, on a Wednesday night, Jason was washing dishes after dinner and I was at the kitchen table with my laptop. He said, without turning around, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we had just started something together? Years ago." I looked up. I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "I don't know. Something where we were going in the same direction. Building the same thing." He kept washing. Turning the dish, rinsing it, setting it on the rack. He said, "I think I always assumed we were on the same team." And then at some point I stopped noticing whether that was actually true. I closed my laptop. I said, "I think you always assumed you were the team and I was supporting." He didn't say anything. The water ran for another minute. Then he turned it off. He dried his hands and said, "That's probably fair." I said goodnight and went to finish working. He went to bed. The house was quiet. Then came the phone call from Greg Foster. It was a Thursday in November. I was in my office when Greg called, not Jason's number, mine. He was a meticulous man who wore reading glasses on a chain and never made small talk. He said, "Claire, I hope this isn't inappropriate." He paused. "We're exploring some options for the company. Restructuring scenarios. And your firm's name came up in a conversation with one of our board members." I said, "I see." He said, "I want to be direct. We need a capital partner who understands the operational side. Someone who can move quickly. The board thinks there might be a fit." I let him finish. I said, "I'd be willing to have a conversation." We met the following Tuesday at a hotel conference room downtown. Greg came with one board member, a woman named Patricia who had the contained energy of someone who has managed difficult situations before. I came with Sonia and Marcus. We talked for 2 hours. Greg had done his research. He knew the shape of my company. He knew what we had built. At the end, Patricia said, "We'd like to move forward if the terms make sense." I said, "Let me have my team put together a proposal." What Jason did not know was that the person his own CFO had called to rescue the company was his wife. The one he had described as running a little agency. The one who still played the startup game. The acquisition vehicle was registered the following week. When it was done, Sonia sent me a message at 7:30 in the morning. "We're ready." I replied, "I know." In December, Jason's company sent out an invitation to a general all-staff meeting. Strategic announcement, company direction Q1. Jason mentioned it at dinner the week before. He said there would be some restructuring announcements. He used the word pivot 3 times. I said it sounded significant. He said it was under control. I said I was sure it was. He looked at me for a half-second longer than the conversation required. Then his phone buzzed, and he looked at that instead. The meeting was held at a conference facility near downtown Dallas. I arrived with Sonia and Marcus and took seats in the third-to-last row. A few people glanced at us and didn't place us and moved on. Michelle Turner was there. She ran Jason's marketing department and had been with the company from near the beginning, one of those people so fundamental to an organization that removing them would change the texture of the whole place. She was sitting 2 rows from the front with her laptop open, working until the moment the meeting began. David was there, the manager from the Christmas party who had asked with genuine curiosity what my company did. He was sitting toward the middle with a pad of paper and a pen. Jason came out from a side door. He was wearing the charcoal gray suit, the one he wore when he needed to project authority. He thanked everyone for coming. His voice was steady. He was controlling it carefully. I had lived with this man for years, and I knew the difference between his natural steadiness and the steadiness that requires effort. Then Greg walked up. The first slide said, "Acquisition approved." A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp. More like a collective shift in weight. The second slide had a logo on it. My logo. The room went very quiet. Michelle Turner stopped typing. I watched it happen from 20 rows back, the sudden stillness of her hands, her chin lifting, the moment of processing. The regional sales manager in the 3rd row turned to the woman next to him and said quietly, "Wait. Is that Claire's company?" Someone near the back made a short, startled sound. The kind of half-laugh that escapes when your brain encounters something it can't immediately categorize. The next slide was the signature page of the acquisition document. The signatures were real, and there was nothing ambiguous about what they meant. I stood up. I walked from the back of the room to the front. I was aware of the sound of my footsteps. The room tracking the movement. Jason standing slightly to one side, the presentation lit up behind him. Between slides, when the screen went dark for a moment before loading the next one, I saw his reflection. Just his face, for a second, looking at itself in the black glass. Then the screen lit up and I was standing at the front. I had thought about this moment many times. The versions where I said something pointed. Where I referenced Christmas parties and barbecues and parking lots. Where I made the reversal explicit. I decided against all of those versions. I talked about the company. The operational plan. The client relationships that would be maintained without interruption. The staffing structure, which was not going to change significantly. The debt being restructured with the new capital. The timeline for integration. I said all of it plainly. Because those were the facts and the people in that room needed them. When I finished, there was a 5-second silence. Then the room started moving. People talking, phones coming out, chairs pushing back. I walked back to my seat. Sonia already had her notebook open to a new page. Jason came to my office 4 days later. Not the old office. The new one, 8th floor on Commerce Street. He knocked on the open door. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple shirt, what I always thought of as his real clothes. The clothes he wore on Saturday mornings when he was just himself. He looked tired in a way that was different from tired after a long week. He sat down across from me. He said, "I think we should leave the past in the past. I think there's a path forward that makes sense for both of us. I want things to be the way they were." He was not talking about our marriage. He was talking about the organizational chart. He wanted to find a way to reattach himself to the thing he had lost, using our history as the lever. He said he knew the company, the clients, the industry. He said it made operational sense for him to stay in a leadership capacity. I looked at him. I opened the desk drawer on the left side. I took out the glass award. Founder of the Year, 2017. I set it on the desk between us. I said, "You always wanted me to be judged by results." Pause. I said, "As it turns out, that's exactly what happened." I did not say anything else. I watched him look at the award. His hand did not move toward it. Whatever reflex had always driven him to touch it when he was talking about business, that reflex was absent now. He looked at it the way you look at an object that used to mean something and no longer does. He sat there for a minute. Then he stood. He said, "I see." He walked out. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway. Then the elevator. Then nothing. I carried the glass award to the storage room at the back, where we kept the archive boxes and the extra supplies. I put it in a box. I labeled the box Miscellaneous, Q4. I put the box on the middle shelf. If you were in Claire's position, would you have offered Jason a role in the new company, or would you have let him walk out knowing exactly what he was leaving behind? Tell me in the comments. And if this story landed for you today, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.